This is Jack Fishman behind the camera talking to cellist Emmanuel Lopez. Manny is the cellist in the Harrington String Quartet and plays both traditional modern cello and Baroque cello. And we're talking to Manny today about historically informed performance practice. What does that really mean? First, Manny, you play all sorts of regular repertoire. Aren't you about to go on tour playing the Fishman cello concerto?
Correct.
Where are you going to be playing it?
I'm going to be doing it with the Santiago Philharmonic in Santiago, Chile, and the San Juan Symphony in Argentina.
That's great. But lately, you have a traditional background. You studied at Yale, you studied at Juilliard. You were the quintessential romantic cellist. What made you start to be interested in historically informed performance practice?
I think the turning point for me was actually listening, going to a concert of the famous Dutch cellist Anner Bilsma back in 1992. Up until that point, I was a Baroque hater, so to speak, because I was really trained in a very, conventionally romantic style of playing. But up until that point, beginning at that actual date in 1992, when I went to see him perform Bach Suites number 1, 3, and 5, that was when I actually started to have to rethink, not play differently, but at the moment, rethink my entire concept of what it means to be a period player, a musician.
What does that term mean, period player? What period are we talking about?
We're talking about probably, most likely Baroque, in the Baroque period, where we're dealing with different technologies in the cello.
So we're dealing with the 16th and 17th century.
Precisely.
What are those different technologies?
Well, I guess by comparison to today, for instance, their setup in the instrument was much more different. Gut strings, plain gut strings all throughout. A shorter sound, a shorter bass bar in the instruments. Let's talk about the cello. A much shorter bass bar than today's.
What is a bass bar?
The bass bar is a piece of wood that goes actually from here to here inside the instrument, which allows for a greater, it depends, depending on how short or how long it is, it allows for greater resonance in the instrument, and coupled with conventional modern tensions, you're able to project much more easily sound-wise.
So why did the instruments start to change?
Primarily, concert halls got bigger, composers began to write in larger forms, and they needed more sound. Perhaps starting with the pivotal symphony, Eroica Symphony by Beethoven, the symphony was never the same after that. Composers wanted bigger sounds, larger scope of the music that was being performed at the time, and composed rather. And of course, the concert halls, the audiences began to get exponentially bigger. So you needed the technology to go with that. You needed the changes in the technology of making instruments to go along with the necessities of what the composers wanted to convey through their music.
Okay, so besides the technical, and I'll put it in quotes, improvements, close quotes, of a cello which made it louder, what other were some of the stylistic changes that happened from the 17th century to the 19th century?
Baroque music versus transitional and then romantic music brought about phrase styles in terms of phrase length. The phrases got longer, more periodical, 4-bar phrases and so forth. And I think the element of sound projection directly affected the way in which you would phrase a certain piece of music. I think the fact that your sound had to carry further, it really required require the technique to be able to carry that sound further, alongside, a tighter tension in the instrument, so that you'd be able to dig in, so to speak, sound-wise, to be able to project that sound, and that phrase got much larger and got much more resonant.
What about the left hand? Now, vibrato is more prevalent in Romantic era. Is that about projection too?
Very good, yes. Vibrato is, besides being a tension-releasing tool, it's also a sound-projecting device. Vibrato will expand the resonating capabilities of the instrument.
Can we hear an example of that?
Let's say non-vibrato. Vibrato. There is an element of projection. Vibrato expands that idea.
And how about phrasing? You said that as players had to project and phrases got longer. How might that affect your interpretation of something?
It's hard to put into words.
Could you give us a quick example? Just play a phrase. First, play it romantically.
All right.
Now, that obviously was not written in the Baroque era, but if it had been, what might it have sounded like?
Well, that was written in the Baroque era.
What was that? Sorry?
That is the second minuet of the C major suite.
Oh, I'm sorry. My mistake. It sounded very romantic.
I know.
So let's hear that more in a Baroque style.
I'm going to have to use it as a different
Sure.
instrument.
Switch to a different cello.
All right.
And you're switching to a different cello because you have this second cello set up in much more of a Baroque style. So you're not going to use an end pin. You've cut the fingerboard. You've changed the strings. And let's hear that same exact music in a Baroque style.
And also, I've lowered the tuning of the instrument to 415.
So basically an A is now almost an A flat.
It's basically an A flat, yeah.
Okay.
So, the same phrase.
Okay, now just for contrast, let's go back to the first one. Play the exact same phrase again, back to your more romantic style, maybe as Pablo Casals or another early 20th century cellist would have played it before all this historically informed performance practice became popular. Sounds like a different piece.
First of all, the articulations in the bow are very different. Traditionally, from the time of Casals on, we've tended to play much more legato than Baroque players would do during their lifetime.
And define the word legato.
Legato is playing many more notes per bow, such as I demonstrated a minute ago, rather than what they would do in the Baroque time, which is separate. The best source that we have for the Bach suites is Anna Magdalena's copy of a fair copy of Johann Sebastian, which is no longer extant. So, in the articulation, there is barely any slurs that she copied. We don't know if, essentially, I think the conventional wisdom, or what we have in terms of information, she wasn't a great copyist. She was really exercising her, she was furthering her education by copying his music out of, finished copies of his. But she was not very careful about articulations. She certainly wasn't as careful as Johann Sebastian Bach. His fair copy of the violin partitas and sonatas are very specific. They're very carefully done in terms of the articulations. She was much more haphazard about it. So we're not quite sure what the original might have looked like in terms of articulations. But since Bach, I mean, the amount of the plethora of editions that we've had since then, conventional, modern, romanticized type of editions that have come out, they tend to be much more, the interpretation of it is much more of a legato culture than there would have been in those days.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Jack Fishman again behind the camera speaking to cellist Emmanuel Lopez.